In this section, we'll discuss the needs analysis for an athlete. To begin with, we'll start looking at more of a high-level overview of what is the sport. In basic sense, describing the sport and understanding the key constituents that make up that sport and that make that sport unique unto itself. So the first thing we're going to look at is the movement patterns. Now, it's really important when you're faced with a new sport, and you'll notice that many of the sports that we're going to look at throughout this section are what we might term as left field sports, or certainly sports that don't exist in the popular sphere. And it's important to understand that when we're conducting our needs analysis, and particularly our sport analysis, we really enter this frame of mind in an unbiased way, without any previous preconceptions or potentially misconceptions that you might bring with it. So to begin with, we'll look at movement patterns. In this way, what we're going to try to do is understand what are the key constituent parts. How much of the movement is linear, forwards or backwards, lateral, sideways, rotational potentially. How much time is spent aloft in the air through jumping or striking. How much time is spent in a prone position, as in our top right-hand corner with the bodyboarder, or in a supine position, in effect, with our rock climber in the top left-hand corner. So when we're thinking about movement patterns, it's important to almost remove everything else from the frame of view and think about it almost as a game of taboo, if you've ever played that. So imagine in the bottom right hand corner we have two badminton athletes, and imagine you're playing the game of taboo, whereby you're given a card that says badminton on it, but there are a number of keywords beneath that card that say what you are not allowed to say. So for example, you're not allowed to say badminton or racket or shuttlecock or anything like that, and you just have to describe what that sport is. So in this way, we might say, well, here's the team sport with two individuals. There appears to be a lot of high intensity multi-directional movement, where most of the movement is in a forwards and backwards pattern and a lateral side to side pattern. There is some overhead striking of an object and a lot of landing on single limbs in an asymmetric and unbalanced fashion. So we can start to describe what happens with the movement patterns. Secondly, we might want to think about, is this a team or is this an individual sport? And in essence, what we're trying to do here is understand how the different constituent parts of that team or of that individual sport impact the physiological requirements that eventually we'll try to unpack and understand in a bit more detail. So if we look at the left-hand side, an archer, for example, is clearly an individual sport. It is just the archer, just the bow, the arrow, and the target. And there is no real influence of any other individual on the physiological requirements of that skill set. But if you think about the top right-hand corner now, we move from less of an individual sport to more of a team sport, where we have three different members on this team. We have the individual directing the rock down the ice in our curling example, and we have our two other members who are going to direct the rock towards the center circle. Right, so we have these different requirements of these different positions, and these might have different influences on the team. In the bottom, this is a really complex system of systems, if you think about it in that sense, where we have America's Cup hydrofoil sail racing, where we have many, many different moving parts, different requirements, different cognitive demands as well. And so this is going to be a really interesting piece to dive into when we think about, is this a team or an individual sport? Equipment is something that I find to have a lot of value in it, and it's really interesting to look at the history of the sport as well. Now, you may be wondering why that is. Well, if you think about the equipment that people use, often over time, there are improvements in the technologies that our athletes are using. And these often lead a little bit of a clue as to what are the key performance indicators and what are the key requirements of that athlete to be able to perform at their very best. And so if we think about this bottom right-hand corner, the Super G downhill skier, you might notice that the positions of guards have changed from being more frontal to more lateral, or vice versa. And this might give you clues as to the fact that certainly in Super G downhill skiing, frontal area and surface area and resistance to wind is going to slow the athlete down. And so this might give us an indication as to the fact that, yes, we need very powerful and strong athletes in Super G downhill skiing, but we want to maybe limit the frontal surface area and therefore not increase the muscular volume of the shoulders potentially too much, because there is a trade-off there. And so I think it's quite interesting to look at the equipment, and also in a certain sense how that equipment might either prohibit certain movement patterns or encourage other movement patterns that may or may not be a consideration for your programming in the future. Something that's potentially a bit more obvious when we think about needs analysis is the sport non-contact by nature? Is it contact by nature, or is it collision? And are these things part of the game, or are they incidental? So if you think about non-contact, for example, obviously our velodrome cyclist in the bottom right-hand corner is very much a non-contact sport, right? It's the individual, the bike, and hopefully there is no contact or collision with the ground or other athletes, although in some rare circumstances that may occur. If we look at the left-hand side in our netball example, it's not really a contact sport, but there is incidental contact here and there, similar to basketball. But if we think about the top right-hand corner in a true contact and collision sport, like rugby, rugby union, rugby league, rugby sevens, and also American football and other styles of contact and collision sports, there is a need and a demand and a characteristic of that game to be involved in contact and collision. And so how are these things going to frame what we need to ask our athletes to do and prepare our athletes to do? And that we'll get into certainly when we come to the actual athlete analysis after the sport analysis. Considering the motor skill demands of the sport is also very, very important. Now we have three very divergent pictures here. If we look at the top right and we have a snowboarder, half-pipe snowboarder, it's clearly a huge, full-body, high-intensity motor skill dominant sport where the athlete is oftentimes rotating in space, in the air, inverted, going from a hard surface to a soft surface. So we have these different skills and requirements of that full body demand. And then the bottom right hand corner, the skeet shooter or the markswoman, clearly there is now more of a demand on the visual acuity as well as the fine motor skills of pulling the trigger with a certain pressure to release the round, but not change the trajectory of the round out of the barrel. Right. So we have all these different kinds of motor skill demands. And certainly with golf, it's a large full body motor skill demand, but also with some fine intricacies in the hand that may influence the speed of the ball, the spin of the ball, and where it's being placed on the green. I think it's really important here, though, as sports performance professionals, and often young sports performance professionals tend to get a bit carried away with this, is that our goal is to influence the physiological development and the physical skill sets of that athlete, right? In this way, it's really important that we don't get too carried away and too cute with trying to influence the actual sport execution and the skill execution of the athlete. And to paint a picture of this, it would probably not be your best judgment to bring, for example, a golf athlete into a weight room environment and think, what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask this athlete to bring in their club with them this time. And I'm going to strap a band up to this club. And then I'm going to strap another band up to their waist as well. And we're going to perform these movements. And this is really going to help improve their golf game because we're physically representing the actual skill requirement in a weight room setting. Now, while you may think logically this makes sense, 9 times out of 10, you're actually going to be doing a disservice to the athlete because the way in which you're messing with the timing constraints and the sequencing patterns of that skill development under constraints of restriction and resistance is often going to throw that actual skill off. And so it's important that we, in a sense, stay in our lane with the fact that we're trying to develop the physical qualities that underpin their ability to express their skills in sport practice and competition. Playing surface is a unique one that to some is obvious and others not so much. But this is going to massively influence your exercise selection and the logical mindset that you have when you're approaching rate of force development, reactive strength qualities, power, rotational abilities through the ground. And as you can appreciate in these 4 different examples, we have vastly different conditions underfoot. So in the top left-hand corner, you might have a fell runner who on one day, the ground surfaces might be hard, shingle and shale. On another day, it might be soft, muddy surfaces. Uphill, downhill, the terrain is coming at different depths, different duration of that different quality of surface. And so we have these different constraints on the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip. So this is really a really challenging environment in which to program for and prepare this athlete for. Adjacent to it on the right-hand side, we have beach volleyball or sand volleyball. And you can also appreciate that being able to project one's body into the air and get the arms above the net to block or spike the ball to the other side is going to be impacted by the ability of the athlete to produce force into the ground, which is not accepting of force, or sorry, it is very accepting of force. It doesn't respond to that force and protect the athlete from it. And so it's really important to consider these playing surface requirements. Substitutions are also something that we should pay attention to as sports performance professionals, because substitutions are going to have a large impact on the physiological requirements of various different athletes on the team. And now these physiological requirements may be position specific, but it's important to know how these substitutions and the rules and regulations and potentially the tactical strategies of the head coaches might influence what the requirements are of that individual athlete, or potentially of the group of athletes that make up that position group. So if we think about something like wrestling, for example, there are a constrained time frame as to the round, as to how long it might last, but it may be a little bit shorter, maybe longer, and there may be more breaks and more resets to the positions of the athletes based on what is happening. In ice hockey, there are line shifts, and so we know that some athletes will be on the ice while others will not be on the ice, and we can understand a bit of a work to rest ratio. But while that is known, what is unknown is how long those line shifts may last, again, dependent on what's happening on the ice. And so we need to have an appreciation of what are the true worst case scenarios in terms of the substitutions and when an athlete might be able to rest and recover. And that's something we'll get into with the actual athlete analysis as well. I think the rules and regulations of any game are really important. And if you want to be the best sports performance professional that you can be, I think it's really important that you have an appreciation for these rules. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to dive into the rule book and understand rule 10.4.2 about the offsides. But I think it is important to understand how might these rules and potentially the changing of the rules influence, again, the physiological requirements of that athlete. And in doing this as well, this obviously stands you in really good stead to have great conversations and productive conversations with coaches and athletes about how we might train better in order to explore potentially the gray space around the rules and make them work in our favor. Event duration is something that factors into energetic system and metabolic demands of the sport, but it also depends on recoveries and how we're going to prepare our athletes in the long term. And so here we have three pictures of, again, vastly different sports, which is the entire point of these graphics. In the top right hand corner, we have Lydia Valentin from Romania, who's an Olympic weightlifter, and her sport, her event duration, the individual lift may last anywhere between 6 to 10 seconds from the first pull off the ground to completing of the overhead lift and the jerk. In the bottom right-hand corner, we might have an example like cricket or test cricket, whereby scores are aggregated over a period of 3, 4, 5 days, dependent on the duration of the competition. And a really extreme example of this might also be world yacht racing and sail racing, whereby that duration, that event may last upwards of 2-3 months. And so how are we going to prepare our athletes for these repeated exposures? And how are we going to understand what are the energetic system demands of that event, and how can we recover well between those events? Method of scoring, again, similar to rules and regulations, I think is something that we need to have an appreciation for, because it may influence our thinking when we're designing our programs and strategizing about how to develop these athletes in the long term. And so on the left-hand side, we have an example of an AFL oval, and you can see there's 4 different posts, and there are about 3 different methods of scoring through those posts. And so the best method of scoring is to score below, in between the 2 center uprights, in between the padding, and that would be what's called a goal and be worth 3 points. But we also know that scoring above the padding is worth 2 points as well, which is called an over. And so we might have an appreciation that these athletes really need to have strong hip flexors and knee extensors to be able to strike the ball with force to send the ball through those uprights. Now, again, that might be position specific, but we have an idea that this is a key performance indicator for us because the method of scoring dictates that. There may be some sports that are very well defined, as in AFL, but other sports may be a bit more aesthetic in their qualities, like, for example, highboard diving or dressage as well, where you don't just score the athlete, for example, but you also score the horse that's involved. So again, how are these things going to influence our mindset when we come to programming and prescription? And then finally, vocabulary. Again, similar to rules and regulations, this is something that it may not have a huge influence on what you do in a day-to-day environment, on the field, off the field, on the court, off the court. But I think this is something that is really, really important to immerse yourself in the sport and to understand what the athletes are saying, right? Talk the talk and walk the walk is often a phrase that you hear. And so having the vocabulary, understanding what the athletes are talking about, understanding what the coaches are trying to convey is important. And so 3 examples for you here, working with judo athletes in the bottom left-hand corner. Here we have a hip toss, and the end result of which is known as an ippon, right? Getting the athlete on their back. Top right-hand corner, we have a b-boy, and his power move he's performing right now is called a 1990. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have an AFL athlete who you can't really see, but at the bottom frame there, you can kind of see the hair of somebody's head between his knees. He's actually kneeling on the shoulders of somebody who is also himself standing up to catch the ball in the air, which is known as a specky. And so having this vocabulary stands you in really good stead to have productive, again, conversations with your athletes and coaches. So moving on now from our sport analysis, we've described exactly what the sport is, but now we need to understand what are the key physiological requirements of an athlete to perform well in this sport. And oftentimes, the first place I go to is who is the best in the world at this sport? If it's an individual sport, who is the best in the world and who has been the best in the world for the longest time? If it's a team sport, again, similarly, which teams are the best in the world? Where do they come from? What are their cultures like? How do these things influence their ability to be the best in the world? And now we're going to start to frame our athlete analysis to really think about the true physiological requirements that underpin success. Anthropometry may be the thing we think of most frequently when we think about needs analysis and annual planning for an athlete to develop physiological qualities to perform well at their sport. And often I tend to think about the extremes of the spectrum. So if we look at the top right-hand corner versus the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, we see in the top right-hand corner a sumo wrestler, huge human beings, massive amounts of fat mass, massive amounts of lean mass that underpin that structure. But clearly a key performance indicator for their sport is to be powerful and also immovable, right? And so we need as much mass as possible. It's a contact and collision sport, and therefore padding as well is going to help with that athlete's longevity across the season and across their career. In the bottom left-hand corner, conversely, you see our ultra marathoner or our fell runner who is having to navigate 50, 75, 100 miles cross-country terrain. And so moving a large amount of mass and fat mass across that terrain is energetically costly. And therefore, we know that we need to have our ultra marathoners be slight, but powerful and resilient as well in order to sustain that effort across that massive duration. Some other considerations about anthropometry might be regional differences. And what I mean by regional differences is different parts of the body. In the top left-hand corner, we have an Olympic kayaker from New Zealand, and you can see the hypertrophy that she has through her upper body. And so we can appreciate from this picture alone, without even really diving into the sport too much, that clearly there's a lot of emphasis on the upper body because it's performing a lot of the workload. And this, again, may start to influence what you're doing in your programs to support this athlete's physical development. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have a positional difference picture as well. So this is the South African rugby team, the Springboks, and really you can start to appreciate the numerous different body types, sizes, shapes, statures of these athletes. And they're all there for a reason. All these different positions have different positional requirements, and being tall in one position might be advantageous, while being short and lean and fast in another may be advantageous there. And so we have to start to appreciate what are the requirements of that athlete, what allows them to perform well in their role, in their position, specific position group, and how might we influence anthropometry in athlete A versus athlete B accordingly. Injury mechanisms are a key consideration for us as sports performance professionals, certainly when we're speaking with our sports medicine counterparts as well. And understanding the different kinds of injuries that might occur in a sport are also very telling of how we might be able to structure our programs to best make our athletes robust and resilient. So are our injuries insidious in nature, such as athletic groin strain in tennis athletes, tennis elbow, Tommy John surgery in baseball? Is there an insidious onset that results in eventually a catastrophic ligament tear that we need to be aware of? And how might we be able to manipulate our program to help deal with some of these insidious onset injuries? Or are they more acute injuries, such as a crash in the Tour de France? Are these injuries potentially life-threatening, like falling off a surfboard at Jaws in Hawaii, right? And how might we be able to influence the chances that athlete is able to recover from something as catastrophic as that? As sports performance professionals, we're often referred to as strength and conditioning coaches, and so strength is no stranger to us. And it's clear from many athletes that we see, particularly in the limelight on TV, that those athletes with large frames, large amounts of muscle mass, it's clear to us that strength is a predominant factor in the success of their sport. And so if we think about a offensive lineman in football, American football, or a defensive lineman, they have to be incredibly strong to be successful at a position, because we're wrestling against another individual who is also incredibly strong. In discus, our success is determined by how far we can move that discus, and therefore how much force we put into the ground through the kinetic chains of the body into the discus is going to influence the flight of that discus. And clearly strength is a very important factor for Lawrence Sequoia of Great Britain here. But when we think about strength, we often think about muscle mass and size. But what about strength endurance with our bottom right-hand corner with somebody like a rock climber who needs an incredible amount of strength to be able to climb the face of a rock wall, but they might need strength endurance over a long period of time in order to sustain that effort. Power is something else that we're pretty familiar with as sports performance professionals. But to me, power is a little bit of a misnomer. And the reason I say that is often we think about power in terms of something like powerlifting. But in powerlifting, they have an incredible amount of strength and they are able to display an incredible amount of force, but it's over a relatively long duration. For me, when I think about power, I think about fast application of force into the ground. And therefore, my mind splits force into these two kind of broader categories, with strength being absolute force development and power being relative force development in a short period of time. And if we think about power, we often think about alpine athletes, bobsled, skeleton, luge. We might think about gymnasts, okay, who have to have an incredible amount of strength and able to hold an isometric position at the ankle to rebound as fast as they can off of the ground to perform a triple double in time to land in a safe and controlled manner. Speed kills is a phrase we hear all of the time, but quite often we tend to get boxed into the thought that speed is about sprinting and linear acceleration and maximal sprint mechanics. But it might not be. If we think about something like cricket fast bowling, yes, approach speed is a huge determinant in the speed of the ball, but what about the ability to rotate the articulation of the shoulder fast, okay, and achieve ball speed through that articular rotation? What about BMX racing, where the vast majority of the outcomes are determined by the exit from the gates and how fast those athletes can turn their legs over? So what is their leg speed, their limb speed? And clearly boxing and any kind of combat sport such as MMA, striking an opponent in the face, striking an opponent in the body, the detrimental nature of those strikes are going to be largely determined by the speed of the strike and the ability to contact obstructively and perpendicular to the body. And so having good speed in these limbs is really important too. Change of direction is an often touted athletic quality and an often explored quality that strength and conditioning coaches and sports performance professionals and athletes alike wish to improve as much as possible. And we see this all the time in something like the NFL Combine, where it's lauded and it's accepted as a key performance indicator for a sport like American football, especially with somebody who's a high agility athlete, such as a wide receiver. We could also think about change of direction in terms of a fencer and a strike and a counter strike. The ability to exploit space, create space as quick as possible is going to be a key performance indicator for them. In the top right-hand corner, we have the sport of kabaddi, which is a hugely popular sport in Pakistan and India as well. And here you can see we have a raider in the maroon outfit who's put his foot across the bulk and the bonus line, and now he's going to try and retreat back across the center line before being caught by the opposition. And then interplaying these kind of change of direction with surface as well that we talked about previously, how might change of direction on ice differ from change of direction on turf, for example. So these are things we need to start exploring and thinking about, as they may influence our programming and prescription down the line. And one of our final thoughts is about mobility and flexibility as well. Now, is mobility there for the performance benefit that it displays, or is mobility and flexibility there for reducing the risk of injury? And it could be a combination of the two. So if we think about ultimate on the left-hand side here, we can see here that the athlete in the white top is displaying an incredible amount of hip abduction, mobility, and potentially flexibility too. And clearly this is of a performance benefit, making her body as long and as wide as possible to reduce the options of the athlete in the black top from releasing the disc. In the top right-hand corner, we have two jiu-jitsu athletes rolling, and we can see that the athlete in the white gi is in an armbar position. Now, it might be of benefit for the athlete to have good, controlled mobility in the shoulder joint so that he can begin to work his feet around and remove himself from the armbar position. And so thinking about these various different qualities of mobility and flexibility, and not just assigning them as you believe the athlete should be mobility or flexible, but you can then start to think about how might mobility improve performance and how might mobility reduce the risk of injury. And finally, energy systems demand. Now, this can be a whole topic in and of itself, and is often the determining factor in an athlete's success, particularly in a sport like biathlon, one of the most cardiovascularly intense sports on the planet, where an athlete has to perform cross-country skiing in an alpine environment, both uphill and downhill, and then get into a prone position and shoot a target that is maybe 2 to 3 inches wide while reducing their heart rate from that previous exertion. We have other energy systems demand that are clearly on the opposite end of the spectrum, something like javelin throw that again lasts anywhere from 6 to 8 seconds to release the javelin at maximal speed as possible. And then we have other athletes involved in other sports that it's kind of questionable, or maybe we don't really know what the energy system demands are. They're not obvious to us, such as in Formula One Grand Prix racing, where we kind of think, well, really, what are the energy system demands of somebody who's sitting in a cockpit for a period of 2 hours? Are there any, or is it just like sitting in a chair? Well, you'd be surprised to see when you dig into the literature just how high these athletes' heart rates get and what the demands on their body are from these incredible G-forces and the heat that is achieved by sitting in a cockpit in the Bahrain Grand Prix, for example. And so to summarize here, let's look at all our sport analysis elements to begin with. We had our movement patterns, describing them, the constituent parts that make up that sport, what makes it unique. Is it a team or individual sport? And how do the different positional requirements influence the other people on the team as well? Remember I said that equipment can be particularly interesting because it leaves clues to us as to what the key performance indicators might be. Is it contact, non-contact? Are they incidental or intentional? And is it really truly a collision sport such as rugby or boxing or MMA? What are the motor skill demands of this sport? Does it lie more towards the fine end of the spectrum or more towards the gross motor skill end of the spectrum? Okay, and how might that influence your thought processes when you bring it into periodize and program? What are the playing surfaces? Are they responsive to force or are they absorptive to force? Are they consistent or inconsistent? Remember our fell runner example. What are the substitutions and how might these influence the energy system demands of the team at large or position groups or individuals? What are the rules and regulations and how might that help to steer conversations with coaches and athletes to figure out ways that we might be able to exploit specific areas of the field, specific areas of the court or the track where we might be able to improve our standings? What's the event duration? How does that impact the acute responses of the athlete and how does that impact the long-term chronic responses of the athlete? What's the method of scoring and does that give us any indication as to what we might focus on the most? And finally, vocabulary as well. Can you talk the talk? Can you hold your own? And do you clearly show passion for the sport with the athletes you're working with? And a summary of our athlete analysis. Anthropometry. Do they need to have large amounts of fat mass, large amounts of lean mass, regional body composition differences between athletes, within athletes? How are those things going to influence the constituent parts of your program and when you're going to program things at different times of the year? What are the injury mechanisms? Are they acute in nature or are they chronic in nature? Are they detrimental to the athlete or are they frequent but minimal? What are the strength requirements of your athlete? Remember, strength, we think about absolute force into the ground. Does this athlete require strength, or is this a non-factor in terms of their success in their sport? What about power, the ability to express force in a rapid time frame? This is particularly important for athletes that need to display incredible reactive strength qualities, such as sprinters or gymnasts. Speed. Don't get confused. Speed is not just linear. It might also be lateral. It might be to do with limb speed. It might be to do with an athlete in combination with the equipment they're using or the bike that they're on. How can we influence the speed of the athlete? Because speed kills often. Change of direction. Is it linear? Is it lateral? Is it about closing space or creating space? What are the different limbs that might be involved with changing direction? It might not be the foot ankle complex, the hip. It might be more to do with rotation of the body, the shoulder complex. And are there requirements for mobility, flexibility that might either improve the sporting performance or pull the athlete away from injury risk? Finally, energy system demands. Again, a huge topic that can be a topic within itself and demands a lot of different attention. Clearly, this is something that many of our athletes need to focus on, and it's our goal and our job to help these athletes meet those energy system requirements so that they can perform the skills of their sport to the highest degree under conditions of fatigue.